Hey, trying to come up with some gods or even a full pantheon for your D&D setting? I've got some thoughts and ideas that I think could help. Whether you're wanting a kind of standard run-of-the-mill pantheon or something a little more, this advice works for both. Alright, so here's the thing. I don't know what your setting is like, and there's a chance that you might not know what you want yet either. So over the course of this video, I'm going to throw out a lot of questions to help you get started. The first couple are, what kind of gods do you want to have? And what kind of themes or tone do you want your overall setting to have? Let your answers to those questions inform the rest of your creation process. But before we move on, let me explain why I put those questions first. Gods can have a truly massive influence on a setting, both within the actual setting itself and also on a meta level for the players. Since their influence and power can be so heavy, they can sometimes be a representation of what the setting is about. For example, if your gods rarely or even never interact with the world itself, then that could add some grit or mystery for the people of that world. The people could have so many questions and outlooks just on that premise alone. Have the gods abandoned us? Did they ever even exist? Are they just waiting to return to us? In that instance, the absence of the gods could make the world feel somewhat bleak, but it could also make the people feel much more important in a narrative sense because then the world is being shaped by people instead of divine influence. This is going to seem like a weird reference at first, but bear with me. Terry Pratchett, author of the Discworld series, once compared Tolkien's influence on fantasy to Mount Fuji's influence in Japanese art, and I'd like to highlight a specific part. Sometimes it's big and up close. Sometimes it's a shape on the horizon. Sometimes it's not there at all, which means that the artist either has made a deliberate decision against the mountain, which is interesting in itself, or is in fact standing on Mount Fuji. I think that can apply to gods in D&D, with Mount Fuji being a parallel to D&D gods, because within the context of the game, gods do exist in some way. That's how classes like clerics and sometimes paladins get their powers. Maybe in your setting, they're forces of nature, or even philosophies instead of gods. But either way, there are classes who draw power from some kind of divine influence. The point I'm trying to make is that even the way your gods are in the setting can say a lot about it. If the gods are super present and involved, that has certain implications. If your gods are distant and reclusive, that has other implications. If you want a consistent theme or tone in your setting, make sure that the god's presence falls in line with those things. Then there is the question of, what kind of gods do you want to have? What I mean by that, basically, is how do you define a god in your setting? Are they just people with immense power who inhabit the world? Are they more abstract entities or even ideas that the worshippers have personified? Are they actually on the same plane of existence, or do they rule from afar in some other plane? There isn't a right or wrong answer to any of those. This is your world, so you get to decide. And if you feel overwhelmed by all of that, that's honestly understandable. Again, gods can be a huge concept to tackle, so for now, just focus on which options seem cooler to you. If you change your mind later, you can always go back and change things so they fit how you want them to fit. Before we get too deep in the divine trenches, that sounds really weird, let's not forget that this is a D&D video, so all of this stuff needs to be both functional and relevant to D&D. The reason I bring this up is because the 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide actually has some pretty solid advice for creating your own gods. I highly recommend reading that section if you haven't already. The book talks about gods from, roughly, pages 9 through 13. It discusses god creation in a practical way, specifically for D&D, such as having a god represent each of the cleric domains so the cleric subclasses can fit into the setting. Loose pantheons where the gods are kind of just individuals with their own motivations, compared to tight pantheons where all of the gods are all linked and connected in some kind of way under one religion. It even covers things like a hierarchy among the divine beings. If you follow the book's advice and recommendations, you'll probably end up with a pretty solid start. But let's say you want to develop your gods even further beyond that. What's next? Well, Let's ask a bunch of questions. However, let me just say that you absolutely do not have to have an answer for all of these, especially right away. In fact, if you want to keep your gods seeming all cool and powerful and mysterious, then you should probably leave some of these blank. You know that thing in horror movies where the monster seems really scary and mysterious at the beginning, but as you see more and more of it, it starts to lose its impact and scary factor? That same concept can apply to gods too. The more you and your players know about the gods, the less intrigue there is. Sometimes the mystery is more interesting than the answer. But that's just my opinion. Do what you think is best. It's your world. Speaking of my opinion though, I have another one. The more gods you have in your setting, the less narrative impact those gods will have. I'm gonna use a wild number, like 1,000, just to make an exaggerated point. If the setting has 1,000 gods, they don't feel as special or important compared to a smaller pantheon. Like most things, there's a sweet spot that will vary depending on what kind of world you're making. Although, with gods specifically, while it's possible to have too many, I don't think having too few is a bad thing, if you can execute that idea well. However, a counter-argument to the too many gods problem is that the problem only exists if each god is completely unique. First, you'll start off by making the cool ones like a god of fire or war, but eventually, when you get to god number 742, you've got to start making things like the god of walking your dog, or the god of ceiling fans. If you have different cultures that each have their own gods of fire, and war, and rain, blah blah blah, that's perfectly fine. The problem only comes into play when the power of a god gets diluted by getting hyper-specific about their domain. War is a powerful concept. Fire is powerful. A god of cheese probably doesn't have much power. Anyways, okay, the questions. Let's start with, how did they become gods? Were they born that way? Or is it a position that can be ascended to, or inherited, or even taken? Are they from this world? Or did they come from some other place? Have they always been the gods of their respective domains? Or were there gods even before them, like how the Greek Olympians succeeded the Titans? If you like creation myths being a big part of religions and cultures in your setting, consider expanding on the answers to these. If you're more into the gods being these mysterious and unfathomable figures, consider leaving these answers very vague, or even just blank. Now, in terms of what types of gods you want, in my opinion, there are broadly two types: creators and rulers. Creator gods are exactly what they sound like. They create things. Maybe they created the land, or the sky, or the oceans. Maybe they created life, or even the fundamental forces of nature. Usually, these types of gods are more mysterious because they show up, make some shit, and then kind of just disappear, or shift into the next category: the rulers. Creator gods can influence your world's creation myths. Depending on how many creator gods you have, you could make a bunch of cultures all share the same creation myth, or you could make each culture have their own creation myth about the same god. Or you could even have each culture have their own creation myth about their own gods. There's a lot of wiggle room with that one, but again, be careful about answering too much. When you provide clear and definitive answers for everything that happened, you can lose some cool narrative nuance. As for the ruler gods, they're the ones who kind of govern or are in charge of or provide some kind of concept or idea, like war or fire. Sometimes a creator god will become a ruler after they make all the stuff. But you can also have the ruler gods not be creators. If you go that route, you could play around with the idea of a hierarchy among the gods, or maybe even make it so that the gods didn't make all this shit and just inhabit the planes like everyone else, just at a much higher scale. That brings us to the next set of questions. What are your gods' motivations? What do they actually do with their power? Does the god of war try to encourage warfare between groups? Or do they simply empower anyone who worships them for battle? Does the god of fire seek to burn everything until there's nothing left but ash? Or are they more of a warden who keeps things like wildfires in check so they don't destroy more than what's necessary for the balance of nature? Are they working either with or against other gods or forces to keep their domain on top, like a kind of long divine war? Are they heavy-handed micromanagers who like to fiddle with all of the things that they're worshipped for? Or are they more like a player in a cosmic game of chess lasting thousands of years, slowly nudging their pieces into place to further their goals and agendas? Your god's actions and motivations can be a good way to reinforce the themes and tone of your setting, without you having to directly spell it out for the players. Speaking of reinforcing the themes in a show-don't-tell kind of way, let's talk about showcasing the attributes and personalities of the gods in a practical way. One method, though there are probably more, is something I'm going to call events and stories. Come up with some history for your gods. Come up with some things that they've actually done. It's not enough to just say, this is the god of fire, this is the god of ladybugs. If you want the people in the setting, and also the players, to know what being the god of whatever actually means, then they need to have some kind of track record or history. Create some stories about their exploits or creation myths. Does the god of fire just control or embody fire itself? Or did they create it? Did they ever intentionally or accidentally burn down something important? Even little nuances like that can give your setting a lot of flavor and character. For example, if the god of fire accidentally burned down their house, then immediately you're thinking, 1. This god is kind of a clumsy doofus with way too much power. And 2. This is a cautionary tale to not play with fire. Even the gods are subject to its wrath. With that being said, you don't need to immediately prepare an entire mythology or historical timeline of the gods, but having little stories like that can go a long way. Continuing with the what do they even do set of questions, do you want your gods to be worshipped for one single thing? Or does their domain cover multiple things? Talos, in D&D for example, is a god of storms and destruction. You can combine different aspects together to reinforce a broader theme, like how Talos embodies the destructive nature of storms. Now, somewhat inversely, do you want to have one single god for each kind of domain or idea? Like one god of war, one god of fire, one god of nature, across the entire setting? Or do you want multiple cultures to each have their own unique pantheons? If you want to go with the each culture has their own pantheon idea, then you may want to consider additional things like, do all of the pantheons get along? Or is there conflict just like the mortals down below? Warfare between the gods sounds pretty metal, and can set the stage for some bloody and gruesome holy wars. Do keep in mind though that you can still do that with the single pantheon option. Maybe the god of fire and the god of rain have a long-standing beef with each other. The last thing I'm going to cover for this is the death of gods. What happens when one of your gods dies? Can they even die? If they can, do they go to the same place or places that everyone else goes to? Or is there some special god afterlife? What happens to their vacancy? Is that aspect of the world just forever abandoned if its god dies? Or can someone else assume the mantle? There are a lot of ways you could go with that. Maybe the other gods choose a new successor from among themselves, or even allow a worthy mortal to ascend to that title. Maybe that godhood is just taken by whoever is there to claim it, possibly even by whoever killed the god. This is one of those things that can have a really big impact on the world, so be cautious about how you answer that. Now, you may have noticed that I didn't really talk about gods in relation to D&D that much. The reason for that is because as long as you have a god or gods that are related to those specific player subclasses, then you're free to do whatever you want. Fortunately, those subclasses were designed with some creative wiggle room in mind, so it should be pretty easy to make them work for your world. So, that's it. That's one way to world build gods. There's a lot to consider, so take your time with it. Good luck!